of course. So, well, thanks for inviting me. As Elena said, I'm part of the Stockholm Resilience Center, where I'm now actually focusing on other aspects of social media. So this talk is actually covering research that I've done previously, but there are some connections and I'll mention that. So I'm currently focusing on social media and the influence of bots on environmental misinformation. And of course, there are some connections to communication about invasive species as well. Right. So what I'll be talking about today is, first of all, the motivations, the original motivation to actually work with social media and then look at invasive species. And then I'll cover three aspects that I see and how this can actually be relevant for monitoring of invasive species. One is as social media as a source of observations, as a source of communities, and then as a source of information context that can be helpful in this monitoring task. And I'll briefly talk about what's happening at the moment and some interesting things that might be interesting for researchers who want to work in this area as well. So motivation and origin. So how did this start? It was really about this idea of being able to obtain earlier warnings of critical environmental changes. And that's something that's key research at the Stockholm Resilience Center. So this idea of critical transitions and ecosystems, and how are you able to obtain early warnings to hopefully avoid or adapt to these critical transitions. And the idea was to then use social media for this, explore this as an informal information source. And invasive species were picked as an example because they are drivers of ecosystem change, but also indicators. So they were a really good example to explore this aspect of social media. And this is, of course, not the first research in this area, and research in this area, especially if you're trying to use social media for early warnings, is very much influenced by research on epidemic disease monitoring, because in this field this is being used a lot. So I'm showing you a slide of the most recent example that I'm aware of, which is a tool developed by the European Center for Disease Prevention and Control here in Stockholm. And this is actually going back now almost 20 years, this idea of using informal sources. And it actually originated in the original SARS epidemic in 2003. And after that, epidemiologists started to use informal sources, news, blogs, later social media, and developed systems around this to monitor all kinds of diseases. And of course, this is very much related, or there are some overlaps and some similarities when we're trying to monitor invasive species. So this is the background. I'll briefly jump into the technical stuff, but I'm not going into any details. But of course, if you're trying to collect social media data, then there will be some technical considerations that are required. And while I'm often using the word social media, I'm actually primarily working with Twitter. Sven has actually shown an example using Facebook. There are a number of reasons why Twitter is a good choice if you're trying to sort of get into this field. One is it's got a large volume of information that is accessible, that's available through a public API. There are some more hurdles if you're trying to do really mining and collecting large amounts of information from Facebook or other sites. And Twitter also covers all types of content. So you find text, you find you find images, videos, other types of media, links to other sources. And of course, it's a social network as well. So it has all these aspects. But if you're trying to start, you'll have to make some choices. So what are you going to collect? What kind of public API at Twitter are you going to use? What kind of data are you going to process? So I'm just flagging this up, but I'm not going into any detail on this today. But when we start collecting information, it's a good idea to actually think about what kind of information can you actually expect, what could be useful and for what purpose. And I've tried to summarize this in this grid, and there are two axes. One is information relevance and the information completeness. And that's quite important for the observational aspect of collecting IAS data from a source like Twitter. So one axis, the bottom one, information relevance, is about what is actually mentioned. So it's typically in text that we're using keywords when we're collecting this kind of information. So is there a specific reference to like a specific invasive species using a correctly spelled common name or scientific name even that could make this more specific on what kind of information we could expect here. And the other is the information completeness. So there's lots of metadata associated with these social media posts, geographic information at times, images, and so on. And the more information you have in that area, the more this social media post can actually become like an observation that has all the features that you would need to actually verify a particular species observation. So in this particular example, invasive species. Right, so the first thing I'm going to talk about is Twitter as a source of invasive species observations. And the best thing you can do is just look at a few examples. So, so I'm just stepping through a few tweets and will be commenting them that I've collected. So this is a very general one. So, and it shows that this is, you might find information that is basically used by like a public organization here, a council, informing about the particular invasive species, here the oak processionary. But you will also find observations, sometimes not of the species itself, but if it's remnants or signs that it has been there. So here, these webs that oak processionary moth leave are posted on Twitter. Sometimes there are multiple observations. Here you've got a gray squirrel, but also other observations that have been posted here. So again, an example where you have images, but here also mention of a location. So this doesn't have a geo-coordinates attached to it, this tweet, but it at least mentions the location where this observation has been made. So this is one that's very relevant or has become very relevant recently, Asian hornet. So this is something that has been observed. In this particular case, it doesn't seem to be an Asian hornet, but this has been shared on Twitter, and there were also replies to this tweet. This one is actually an observation on the Asian hornet in France, eating a bee actually. So that definitely is a confirmed observation. It also comes with geographic information, and it seems to be good enough to actually confirm this observation. And that one is an interesting one because it's been posted, and it doesn't seem to be an Asian hornet, but not a European one as well. So there were also some replies to that this might actually be an interesting observation of Vespa orientalis, which was certainly not in the place where you would have expected this. So this is just a few examples that show that you can find observational data on social media. But of course, the question is now, how do you make use of that? And there are a number of challenges associated with it. One is that typically geotag data, so tweets that come with exact geo-coordinates, are very rare, on average 2%, if you look at different studies on this. Then there is, of course, extensive filtering that may be required. And in some cases, that can be done with the help of machine learning, AI classification routines. We've already heard about that. And that can be applied to a number of types of information in these tweets, be it images and or the text, but a lot of filtering has to be done. But as a result, the work that I looked at with regard to using Twitter as a source of species observations, the conclusion was that it's actually a rich source of observations, not just for invasive species. For invasive species, of course, even singular observations could be relevant and important, even if we don't have a broad coverage like we might want to have when we look at other types of species that we might want to collect data on via Twitter. As I said, geo-coordinates are rare, and this will, of course, not work for all types of species. So we're talking typically about casual observations that people post that are not experts. So they've typically seen something that caught their interest and that they found tweet-worthy. And of course, that will not apply to all types of invasive species. So there's a limit to where this can be used. Right. The second perspective is to actually think about Twitter as a source of communities in IAS monitoring. And again, I'll go through an example. So here you have a tweet where someone posted an image and saw this nice, interesting bug. Again, that is a casual observation. Someone saw this, found it interesting, posted it, and was interested in finding out what it actually is. And then started to get some replies. So some suggestion first to how you can find additional information. Then the first tweet that says that that's a tiger beetle, and it continues. So basically this conversation develops and people provide more information with some pointers to additional information. So here's a discussion of which type of tiger beetle is this actually. And more information is provided, arguing that this is a particular type of tiger beetle species. The poster continues responding to that. Some features of this are discussed, and at the end, which I thought was really nice, the original poster even edited the Wikipedia article of this species. So what does this tell us? We actually looked in a study at 200 of these conversations in detail. We went through all of them and then verified the observations. And basically what we found was that there's a high accuracy. And we termed those Twitter conversations and these micro groups that assemble spontaneously embryonic citizen science communities, because they essentially shared a lot of the types of properties and types of interactions that you would find in a typical citizen science community that is tasked with a particular problem, here the identification of a species. Because these observations are collected, they're shared, they're reviewed, verified, and annotated, and all that is happening on Twitter casually in this conversation. And it's happening with contributions primarily from people who are not experts, who take a casual interest in this, but together collect this information. And then what typically happens is that it's forgotten. So basically this is happening, some useful information is collected, but it's not really put to any use. And for me, this is actually one of the most interesting aspects of using social media, not just as a source of observations, which is of course interesting as well, but as a source for potentially citizen science communities. We're talking about social media, after all, a social networking tool, a communication tool. And my suggestion would be, when we're looking into social media as a way to collect information about invasive species or other environmental aspects, to actually see this as a citizen science recruitment tool, because you already have these key embryonic communities that have shown at least a casual interest. And it might be easier to actually motivate and mobilize these people than when you sort of do some kind of broad scale, unfocused, untargeted recruitment for citizen science communities that is done in social media, of course, as well. So, so that's the basic idea: mobilize communities. And I'd like to actually mention, because chatbots have been mentioned before. One of the ideas that I've been trying, or we've been trying to get funding for, unsuccessfully, unfortunately, so far, is to actually combine this. So basically, the kind of interactions that you've seen in this conversation there can be partly automated as well. So thinking about the kind of chatbot that Sven showed us. And the idea is basically to combine this and overlap all these initiatives with citizen science. So you could think about collecting tweets that might be interesting, then recruit a community around this that helps you crowdsource and categorize these tweets and identify which answers, for example, were particularly helpful. And then we actually want to use social bots and train them with the help of these inputs to then start taking over and making useful contributions and being able to react to these kind of posts automatically and independently at some point. So unfortunately, this is very much alive, this idea and the initiative to get funding for that, but unfortunately until now we haven't been able to do that. So the final perspective is to think about Twitter as a source of contextual information. Of course, a lot of the tweets that, for example, might mention a particular invasive species or the topic in general will not contain any observations. So they don't have a value per se in that regard. But they contain interesting information that could be helpful in a project, in a monitoring project, or just to understand, for example, how people perceive a particular species, the threat of a particular species, the way it is managed, responded to, or how, what the impacts might be on their environment. So again, a small study or exploratory study, which has not been published, looking at this example again, Asian hornet. So here you see the frequency of tweets just over 1 year in 2018, mentioning this species either by a scientific name, common name, or descriptive terms, like the kind of thing that people might use. A descriptive term might be, I've seen a giant hornet, or a huge hornet, or giant bee, or something like that. What I can say is that this is actually an underestimate. So the numbers here are much lower than what you would actually get. At the time, I was not able to access the full Twitter archive. I'm now able to do that because Twitter has opened up for researchers access to full archive without any cost. At the time of collecting this data, this was only available through the public API, which only ever gives you a certain percentage of the tweets that match a particular keyword. So what we can see here, that of course this following a seasonal pattern, and there are quite a few mentions of this particular species. You can then start looking at how these tweets, what kind of properties these tweets have and how that could be useful. So is it like a retweet? Is it an original tweet? Is it a reply to someone mentioning an Asian hornet? And that's very typical what you see here. Mostly you'll see that these tweets are retweets. So someone is just forwarding the information that someone else has posted. And a few replies and about a quarter original tweets that mention this without another trigger. People do this out of their own volition. And then you can start looking at how this actually corresponds to particular users. So this is the kind of contextual information that I think is interesting. So if you just look at tweets posted in the UK, you'll see that the top users that post information about this are people that have something to do with beekeeping, and that's understandable in this particular instance because they are affected by this invasive species, the Asian hornet. You can also see how these people have different functions in that network. So whether they are replying a lot or just sort of working as aggregators and distributors of information by just retweeting things, or if they are contributing original information. And that is important. So if you think about monitoring projects, because it can tell you something about the kind of people that you might want to approach if you're trying to spread information about this, that is important, or to recruit people in a monitoring project. Interestingly, in Spain, if you just look at tweets in Spain about this species, the picture is a little bit different. There it's primarily public organizations that are associated with agriculture, but also companies. And that corresponds quite well with the fact that the invasion there is much more advanced. So the commercial aspect has become more important and the response has become more organized. So this is just as an example to what kind of information or contextual information might be interesting. Very briefly, we also looked into tweets that have covering what kind of topics they are actually covering, and that's quite different as well. So you have different signatures for different types of species. So we categorized tweets based on what they were referring to, like the remedy, the management, or is it commercial, these kind of information. And that's quite interesting insights that can help you to well, also assess the importance and the response, the public response in particular to a particular species. For example, the gray squirrel, it's much more emotional. So people either think it's a very cute species or they're horrified when they know that managing the species means that they typically are killed. So that's quite different to the response that you see when people are talking about oak processionary or an advanced threat like the emerald ash borer. Right, conclusions. So 3 things really. Tweets are a rich source of information for monitoring, but the challenges and the merits will vary with the application and the species that you're interested in, of course. So there is no one captures all approach. You'll really have to think about, there are certain tools and methods, of course, that are generic, that can be reused, but you'll have to think about that particular application that you're interested in. And the main thing that I'd like to say is that when approaching this as an information source, Twitter or other social media, I mean, there are things like Instagram, Flickr, and so on that are of interest as well. Look beyond just the observational aspect of that data. Think about that this is a communication and social networking tool that we're talking about here. So, you know, it can be a tool for outreach, for education as well, especially in a targeted fashion, because we're talking about tweets where people have shown at least a casual interest in a particular environmental topic or concern about invasive species. So you can actually reach out to them, and you can contact them also to verify information and complete information, and hopefully to also mobilize people for this, this particular topic. And that's me.
Thanks a lot, Stefan. I think it was a really nice overview and very interesting about social media. Thanks a lot. I'm scraping a lot of social media because I can find new useful reports from them. So Quentin was super fast for the question.
Yeah, I was kind of curious. So as a ecologist, I'm aware of all the difficulties of analyzing observational data, and as you don't understand cause and effect. And I wonder how much Twitter mind you doing experiments as opposed to looking at what is put out there. So in actual fact, sort of tweeting some things out there specifically designed to see the effect of how those tweets going out.
Well, that's an interesting idea. Comes with some ethical challenges, of course.
Oh, yeah, exactly. That's why I'm wondering whether.
So I know that experiments like that have been done, not in our particular domain, but experiments like that have been done. And there are some good guidelines on the ethical sort of approaches to working with internet data in general now that you can rely on. But I'm not aware of that, but I think it would be interesting. And of course, with regard to the example I mentioned with actually building a social bot that would respond to information, to public information posted by people automatically, there are a number of ethical dimensions that should be considered. And the idea in that particular case was to actually also involve people in this project who would look more at the legal aspects and cover that as well. But I think that that wouldn't stop a project like that. So I think it's an interesting idea.
Cool.
Thank you. So there are some questions coming from the chat. I will try to briefly summarize them. Okay, Tim is asking, what would be the most important venue of future work for you to harvest quality alien species data from social media and to improve interaction with people posting it?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that. Maybe Tim.
What would be the most important venue of future work? Tim, would you want to ask directly?
Yes, I was just wondering, thank you for your talk, and I find this super fascinating, especially the aspects where you talk about trying to derive context of records, so to enrich them and I'm really triggered by that, and I wonder for you in the framework of this Horizon Scan, what would be the most important venues for future work? What needs to be better developed according to you to harvest more quality data on alien species from platforms like Twitter or other social media?
Well, for a start, I think, I mean, one of the challenges if you're approaching this is that it's easy to get this kind of data, but everybody's using their own methodology. So in order to have reliable information that we can really consider as valuable research data, I think some shared methodologies and best practices should be developed that also make it easy for people to get into this field. I'll give you one example. When we talk about contextual information, something that's readily available now are, when you do text mining, are unsupervised classification methods like topic modeling. But everybody's using their own approach, and there's no clearly defined best practices to that, which can, well, almost result in reading tea leaves to some extent. So that is one thing. In terms of, I mean, you said you were particularly interested in the contextual aspect of this information. In terms of observational data, I think some more work is actually required to see how representative this is. Of course, social media have biases. They have demographic biases, they have geographic biases, and so on. And really deep studies of how that actually affects the conclusions that we can draw from this aren't really available. And I think there are a number of routes that can be taken to explore this further.
Okay, really good. I hope that through this workshop we can flag that through publishing this horizon scanning somewhere. And the idea is really to flag this kind of issues that are needed to move things forward with various tools and technologies. Thank you very much.
Okay, so Sven was asking if there are examples of citizen science project using this kind of business intelligence to reach out to people and organizations to actively build communities. So if you know any projects dealing with this kind of approach, I mean.
I don't know any projects specifically based on what I've said, that you start by collecting data on a particular issue and identify sort of profiles of people who have shown a particular interest and have some shown a particular expertise in a way, and then use a tool to build around this citizen science community. I think the typical approach is that, of course, you're using social media to recruit people for citizen science projects, but then you use standard communication approaches like flagging things up through hashtags that are important, or using particular networks or lists that you can build, for example, on Twitter, to reach people who hopefully are interested and are hopefully, for whom that is hopefully relevant. But yeah, specifically that approach that I've been laid out, I'm not aware of any project that has used that.
Okay, thank you. I think we have 1 minute and then we have to move for a coffee break. Also, Michael asked if is there anything we can do to support these ephemeral communities for mutual benefit? I mean, he wrote a lot, so I don't know if you want to catch better.
I'm just looking at it. Yes.
And then there is another question from Tom. And then there is Quentin. Oh, where is Quentin? Oh, so Quentin decided not to ask another question. So coffee is more important. I know. Don't tell me. Okay.
So maybe we can actually talk about this in the breakout groups, but very briefly. So the question about creating training data sets, I absolutely agree. So that's one of the things that I mean when I talk about establishing methodologies, so that we can build on this and start applying it to specific questions. So best practices, and I think that would be part of that. And I'm not quite sure this question about supporting these embryonic citizen science communities. Well, basically, I think that I mean, in a way, most of these things are one-off conversations, and then you have people who repeatedly contribute to that. So. I mean, they're going to do that whether we support that or not. It's more about actually providing incentives for them to do this on a regular basis, and maybe also something that alludes to what Sven actually said, sort of direct them to different projects, apps, or whatever, to actually get them off Twitter at some point and actually get them actively involved in other organized citizen science projects. And automation could be one way of doing that.
Thanks a lot, Stefan.